As tensions on the Russia-Ukraine border continue to simmer, a united West has now threatened to impose never-seen-before sanctions on Moscow if Russia invades Ukraine. Now, amid these threats and Russia's firm deployment along its eastern border, the specifics of these sanctions has the world guessing. In the next few minutes, we look at what these punitive measures can be and what America and its Western allies can do against Russia. The big question, of course, is how will it all affect Moscow? Sanctioning individuals via asset freezes and travel bans is a commonly used tool. And if Russia invades Ukraine, then the West will most likely impose targeted curbs against individuals, including the Russian president. Now, this is not us saying this, but the US President Joe Biden himself saying that he will be ready to consider personal sanctions against the Russian president in case of an invasion. Recently, a bill was unveiled by the US Senate Democrats which foresees sweeping sanctions on top Russian officials, both military and government. Moscow says that any such measures against the Russian president will not harm him personally, but will prove politically destructive for the West.
US President Joe Biden has raised the possibility of imposing personal sanctions upon Vladimir Putin. That would be an extraordinary step. What form could those sanctions take is hard to say. I mean, there's no detail at this stage. It would be very difficult to target Mr. Putin's personal wealth because, as the Kremlin said today, officially speaking, he's not allowed to have any bank accounts or assets overseas. That's a rule in Russia. So the Kremlin says, it would be impossible to hurt Mr. Putin in that way. They have said that any kind of move like this would be politically destructive, but would be painless for Mr. Putin himself.
Another measure being considered would be to exclude Russia from the system known as SWIFT, a global financial messaging service. It is used by many and thousands of financial institutions in more than 200 countries. This is not the first time that the possibility of cutting off Russian access to SWIFT is being mulled over. Back in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there were similar whispers, and that prompted Russia to come up with its own financial messaging system called the SPFS. However, the Russian alternative has failed to establish itself in international transactions. Cutting off Russian access to SWIFT is among the harshest of measures that the West can take, and it has the capability to inflict self-harm as well. Experts say that the US and Germany would stand to lose the most from this move, as their banks are the most frequent SWIFT users with Russian banks. The sanction was used against Iran in 2012, and the country lost significant oil revenues and a large chunk of foreign trade. The US could ban Russia from financial transactions involving US dollars. Essentially, any Western firm that allowed a Russian institution to deal in dollars would face penalties. This could have a huge impact on Russia's economy, as most of its oil and gas sales are settled in dollars. Next up are the energy and technology restrictions. We just told you that the Russian economy is hugely dependent on selling gas and oil overseas. The sales are a huge source of revenue for the Kremlin. The West could make it illegal for countries and companies to buy oil from the big Russian energy giants such as Gazprom or Rosneft. If such sanctions are imposed, then the Nord Stream 2 pipeline stands to be abandoned. The White House has also told the US chip industry to be ready for new restrictions on exports to Russia if Moscow attacks Ukraine. The warning included potentially blocking Russia's access to global electronic supplies. Western powers could take action to further block Russia's access to international debt markets as well. The ability of Western institutions and banks to buy Russian bonds is already restricted. In April 2021, Biden barred the US investors from buying new Russian ruble bonds over the accusations of election meddling. The move, if taken, will deprive Russia of access to finance that it needs to grow its economy. The country's cost of borrowing might rise and the value of the ruble might fall. Leaders of the European Union, along with the US, have been holding talks, mulling possible action, but the burning question remains, when and under what circumstances will the West sanction Russia?
As far as I remember, the Congress has already discussed a couple of years ago the possible sanctions against Putin. And again, everybody puts a cause. So Russia has to do something terrible on the territory of Ukraine for this sanctions to kick in and to come into force. And again, I doubt that Russia is planning something terrible, and I doubt that the war is actually the military solution is actually on the table.
Now, as we just told you, the tensions on the Russia-Ukraine border are continuing to rise, and the big question as of now is what kind of sanctions will the West impose on Russia due to fears of invasion of Ukraine? We'll get that information to you in a bit. Now, let's get you some more perspective. Earlier, we spoke to the chair of the UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress, Andrei Dobryansky, from New York. We asked him what he feels about the positions taken by the West, including the US, and is it being influenced by domestic political considerations? Listen in.
I think possibly the fact that it took so long for the West to organize a response to what Russia is doing would be the key influence that I see happening domestically on the West. We notably see it the closer you are to Ukraine. So the countries of Germany and France domestically do not have a lot of support for sending weapons, we know, to Ukraine. However, the further you go away, whether it's Great Britain or the United States, you see much more readiness to support Ukraine. Ukraine is trying to do everything at the moment. First and foremost, they would love the West to send more weapons to be a signal to Russia that harm will come to them if they travel further into Ukraine. At the same time, their populace, individual citizens, are learning tactical medicine, how to treat a wound if your city happens to come under bombing. So they're preparing their citizens. At the same time, we have peace talks going on. Currently, this week in Paris, the Normandy 4, which hasn't met in person since 2019, are sitting around the table. That's Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine, to try to find a diplomatic solution to this problem.
That, of course, is a big story that we're tracking at this moment. The fear of possible sanctions on Russia coming from the West. That is, if Russia, in fact, invades Ukraine. What these sanctions could entail, only time will tell. Of course, the big one is cutting off Russia's access to the SWIFT global payment system. Now, that could damage both sides. And that is what we're trying to answer at this hour on WION. Now, for more information about these possible sanctions, our correspondent Susan Tehrani now joins us live from New York. Susan, thanks for joining us. Now, there's a lot of talk going on right now about possible sanctions. But do you think the U.S. can, in fact, sanction Russia, especially when it comes to SWIFT?
So, yeah, the United States can take those measures. However, the question is whether or not it will go ahead and take that quote-unquote nuclear option. Remember, back in 2014, after Russia annexed part of the Crimean Peninsula, there was talk that the United States wanted to take these measures. However, it didn't go as far as taking those measures. And recently, just a few hours back, Russia did say that should the United States take these measures, it would be very detrimental to the international banking and financial system. At that time, in 2014, Vladimir Putin said if the United States takes these measures, it would be a quote-unquote declaration of war. The problem with taking Russia out of the SWIFT banking system is that it would also affect other countries on the one hand doing business with Russia, because the SWIFT banking system is basically how countries do business and do financial transactions from one bank to the other. And it would also not provide the proper surveillance, if you may, on the part of the United States if it does ultimately want to sanction Russia in other aspects to see whether or not it's violating those sanctions or not. Remember, the United States has knocked off Iran, for example, off the SWIFT banking system, and it did have... While Iran did suffer greatly economically being knocked off of those banking systems, what it did cause is for a lot of money laundering to happen, and it also caused for the United States to not be able to track how and when Iran was violating international and U.S. sanctions as well. So that's one of the downsides to take into consideration.
Right, Susan, let's talk about NATO a bit. The NATO alliance, despite U.S. insistence, seems to be divided at this point and is emerging more as a coalition of the willing. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, there is a lot of talk about, despite trying to really pose a sense of unity, there is a lot of talk about having differences between the United States and NATO. It's not so much that, but it's really a concern about Germany and what it will happen with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Again, one of the aspects that Russia might be, quote unquote, punished if it does decide to go into Ukraine is to stop the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia into Germany. The problem with that is, with the harsh winter cold, Germany is very dependent on that gas pipeline. And what we did see, and just a testament of the rift that's going on right now, I do want to point to the fact that most NATO countries, including the United States, Denmark, and others, have sent lethal weaponry to Ukraine. They are supporting Ukraine. What Germany did was it sent thousands of helmets to Ukraine, prompting the mayor of Kiev to come out and say just a few hours ago, what will Germany send next? Pillows?
Right, absolutely. That, of course, is something that we also have been highlighting on WION. Susan Teherani, thanks so much for joining us from New York at this hour, and thanks for all your insights. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.